All right. Just to highlight the fact that the CivicLab is able to do the first ever all Illinois TIF illumination, courtesy of the support received from the Muck Rock Gateway grants. Your project leader is Tom Tresser. We cobbled together by harvesting over 1,400 TIF reports and placing them onto a massive spreadsheet that would probably be the size of a 4-story building. Our illuminators who did most of the work are Leslie, Stephanie, and Sebastian, and they will join us in just a few minutes to share their insights. But here are the headlines. For the first time, 1,448 TIFs in Illinois were detected across 545 municipalities and 96 counties. Interestingly, we found 84 missing reports from 35 of those municipalities, about 6%. The total property tax removed from the TIFs that we have are $1.5 billion, again, 1 year, the year 2020. But if you take all the amount of property taxes removed by the current reporting TIFs, it's about $15 billion. But this does not include money removed from TIFs that are no longer operating. So we don't have a full picture of all the TIFs that are no longer present across the state, but we do have a complete picture of the TIFs that are no longer operating in the city of Chicago, which is about 50 odd. In other words, TIFs that once lived, did work, but are now gone, they took 17 billion. So if you take the 17 billion of the dead TIFs from Chicago alone, put it with a cumulative of 14, you're at about 30 billion and change. It starts to be a big number. The total expenditures from all the TIFs in Illinois for 2020 was 1.2 billion. And again, a whole set of news stories and news hooks can be generated off of that alone. In other words, where did all this money go? Who got it? What projects? Do the people in the various cities know about these projects, and would they approve of them if they did know? And finally, the big picture number that we repeat and that we're so proud of displaying for Chicago is how much money was left in all the TIF accounts at the end of 2020 in Illinois. The answer is $2.3 billion. And you could say about half of that is from the Chicago TIFs. And we have a weight here because we have a lot of wealth, and it makes sense that Chicago, which contains a lot of, maybe a third of the wealth of the whole state, would contain a majority of the TIF money, but not all of it, obviously. So here again is another way to display this information with the trend line going back to 1980. 1,485 TIFs, as I say, 1.5 billion removed in 2020, 23 billion to date that we know of, just in the state of Illinois. And then you might wonder, how bad is it for the whole country? Well, we estimate that there's 40,000 TIFs across thousands of municipalities extracting, as Jonathan mentioned, $40 billion a year. But it's our goal to try to actually capture all that in a precise manner. But it's our estimation. And since property taxes fund so much important things at the local level, including public education, our number one victim of this TIF taking are our public schools. All right, now at this point, I'd like to bring in, I'll stop sharing. I'd like to bring in our great illuminators and ask them to introduce themselves and to share, what did they make of all this as they were wading through the muck and mining the salt, so to speak, in the salt mines of TIFs. Let's start with Leslie. Leslie, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Cortez. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a youth organizer with the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. I'm also a member of the Intergenerational Leadership Council with Cicero Community Farm. And I'm very grateful for this project. I'm really grateful that we're able to bring transparency to municipalities across Illinois. This is very personal to me, as I grew up in a community where we don't have access to civic engagement, and that is not something that exists in our community. at Cicero, Illinois. In Cicero, we have a population of like high 80% to like 90% Latinx folks who predominantly speak Spanish. And I can't imagine, I never grew up with any of this information. And so I had the great opportunity of meeting Tom and Jonathan in Pilsen, where I got to learn about TIFs. And I had no idea that this was one of the ways that development and gentrification got started, which is something that impacts our communities. And this is really important because we don't even get to have a say in how our land gets regulated, what we want on in the places that we live. In Cicero, Illinois, our tree canopy is 12%. Our park space is 5%. And had we not had the language, the practice, the knowledge of TIFs, there would have been 5 more TIFs introduced into Cicero this past year. And Cicero Community Farm was able to gather community members together to halt those projects from coming, where we would have had even a reduction of 5% of land. And so just some general reflections. I have lots of observations that stick out to me, but one that was extremely technical that I think is important to highlight is that I had no idea that numbers in parentheses meant that there were negative numbers in the reports. Had I not had this training, I wouldn't have not been able to like look out for that. And I assumed that my town was doing okay financially in this project, but the numbers reveal in the project that in the negative or that are owed to the project. So another observation that surprised me is that some municipalities don't have any documents uploaded for the past 3 years, though the purpose of the state's online data portal, that's why it exists. And so this made me really curious about what accountability looks like for community members who are contributing their dollars towards projects they have no idea are happening and that they're not being accounted for. And so in my town, there have been projects like Amazon and Bimbo that have moved into our community, and we already have poor air quality, and we had no say in how these projects came in. And so for my town, we do not have any TIF reports that we can look to. And so, like I said, there was the zoning project, lots of visions of developments, and they didn't want to build that transparency with us. And so we had to really dig in and find out what was happening at the zoning meetings, and which were only happening during business hours. And so, this makes me curious about different towns and who puts down, which towns get to put down more detail, which towns don't, and how there's inconsistency across municipalities, which isn't surprising, but it is insightful. And so another observation that stood out to me is that across county lines, how there's lines drawn between towns and how there's not a consistency. And so just to give an example is there's Aurora and DuPage, but then the TIFs are divided into different towns. And so even if you live in that town, your municipality might not have control of that TIF. And so you might have to like literally drive to another town to advocate to not have those property taxes imposed on you. And it makes it very unclear about where you go for that. And so another observation was inputting the data and seeing TIFs across municipalities also revealed to me that some items are very vague. And so while the line item doesn't allow for a full description, leaving it as vague as administration cost or TIF administration, that to me doesn't reveal transparency. There was one town, Jefferson, where they uploaded 30 pages of everything in their project up to all of their auditing papers, and they provided a lot of financial transparency. And so it just makes me wonder why some towns have transparency and why towns like mine don't. And so I think that's an area of attention because some counties with their TIF numbers, it went from a few thousand to $100,000. And then for me, this is very near and dear to my heart because this is something that impacts not only young people, families who are in education, but it's also how we deal with land, how the history of Indigenous people on this land has been used to, build and these are very unsustainable projects. And when there are cities or towns like mine where we need more access to green spaces, we have schools who have lead in their drinking water, like the drinking water has lead in the pipes. And so these funds can be used to be taking care of our education systems, replacing the lead pipes in Illinois. It can be used for sustainable local farming and agriculture, for housing, for stewardship. And so this brings questions about, what kind of private projects come, but then also how that money is channeled.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leslie. As you can see, we could spend the rest of the day just unpacking what Leslie was sharing with us as a committed organizer and educator who's well versed in their community. Steph, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little about what you took from the project?
Hey everyone, my name is Steph. I helped Leslie and they came to me and introduced this project of TIF investigation. And my observation, oh, and I'm in sister, by the way. So also what Leslie has experienced with the town, I've also experienced it being part of the Cicero Community Farm Multi-Generational Leadership Council. And so echoing a lot of what Leslie had said, I totally agree. And before jumping into like researching everything, I know a little bit about TIFs, but this like really like opened my eyes just to how much money there is. So yeah, I was surprised how high and how low the numbers can get. Besides like zero, but it was like 20 to like really high numbers. And also like where are those funds going, And some of my observations that I noticed that I was surprised to find out is that while inputting data and name of the banks, I noticed in one of the tips the Lakota group was mentioned. And we came across this group when we were researching more about zoning and redevelopments here in Cicero. How the town has this like redevelopment zoning plan for the next couple of years, and how we feel like Cicero is going to be like gentrified, and so to find the same Lakota group, which by the way is not a resemblance of the name, a representation of the name, which unfortunately also echoes what the town of Cicero is, not representation or representative of the community. Um, and so making that connection was like, wow, this was also like from there to there, from here to there. And according to Lakota Group website, it mentions their missions like to create plans that build connections between people, their environments, and their history. So yeah, I'm just not sure how their work is impactful. Like seeing in Cicero about the rezoning plans in upcoming years, but that was just something that I observed. And I also had like a lot of like questions as to like some tips have omitted the section of financing costs. And I thought that was a little sus. Was it intentional? And so yeah, and I noticed there was like some tips that had like all zeros and some like really high numbers again. And then I was wondering like what happens to the funds and fund balance, like at the end of the period, where does it go? And I think as Tom has mentioned, there's some that tips like on the website when you search it, they have like tips on it, but then on the recorded spreadsheet and also like vice versa, um, they they they're expired, but sometimes they don't upload them until you see it on a different TIFF and that same hold on, I'm not sure I'm making sense. Like sometimes they're uploaded, but they're not like recorded, I guess. So that some documents are missing or some tips are missing, but you only find that out until you look at another tip that again, it's very suspicious and you're wondering like, why do they do this? Um, and yeah, and so also, echoing Les, like I didn't know that parentheses meant negative numbers. And you do see that quite a bit throughout the spreadsheet if you're looking at it, and wondering how that impacts things in terms of funding for projects and initiatives. And so, yeah, I'm also really grateful for this experience and hope that this project continues, because there's a lot more to unpack, and like kind of unveiling of where this money is going towards. And yeah, and that's basically like where my kind of observations or like looking at things has
Awesome.
been. Yeah,
Thank you, Steph.
thank you.
Again, you can see many questions that we can't answer from this, but many questions. And then we have Sebastian, also one of our illuminators. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us what you made of all this?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Muckrock for the work that you all have been doing. My name is Sebastian Knowles. I am a community organizer up in Evanston, Illinois. I first met Tom when I was running for mayor of Evanston back in 2020, 2021, and he gave a breakdown of TIFs. And eventually that led to some more TIF activism in Evanston, as they've been attempting to add some more to the city. But going through the project, you know, what Leslie was saying earlier about TIF reports was really shocking to me when I was going through. There were quite a few municipalities that weren't submitting reports, that didn't have reports for 2020, 2021, or 2022 yet, right? And this was pretty commonplace, and it leads to a lack of transparency, right? Residents who live in those respective municipalities can't go and access this information. Watchdog groups such as CivicLab can't do that as well. And there's really no repercussions for not having that information readily available. You know, I understand that some of these municipalities have a population of a couple thousand folks, or even sub 1,000, right? But to not have information dating back now 3 years is pretty alarming, right? Another big observation that I made was that there were plenty of communities that would, especially on the eve of the financial crisis of 2008, right, that there was this massive grab and gravitation towards TIFs in their respective municipalities, one being Rockford, right? And there were large sums of bonds that were taken out towards these TIFs, and these debts have not been paid off almost 20 years later, right? And it shows that the work that they did within these TIF districts actually harmed that community or that respective area, because we're not even seeing an increase in property tax increment, right? There's no growth going on in that community. And that's supposed to be the whole premise of a TIF, right? Is to grow and develop the area. But if that's not even happening, right, you are directly causing a negative harm to that community. And that stems into my next observation, was that the way we evaluate TIF success is inherently flawed, right? I mean, you see TIFs that are increasing in property taxes, right? I'm not saying, oh, you know, we're able to develop an area, this area is becoming more successful, safer, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end of the day, are the people that were previously living in that given area, are those folks still even there? Have we gentrified this entire community, right? That is not captured in any TIF report or any analysis that's done. And we've seen it across Chicago, whether it's in Uptown, Lincoln Yards, et cetera, and across the state, where people are pushed out of where they previously lived. They have to leave their homes because they can no longer afford to live there. And housing prices rise astronomically. And we've seen that again in Chicago, across Illinois, and we see it across the nation as well. So there are many concerns that folks on the ground who are doing the work, you know, whether that's CivicLab, individual activists that have contacted CivicLabs that they are concerned about. And this project allowed us to really get a glimpse of how large this issue is, right? Because there's no central location where all of this is being cataloged, right? We have to go to every single individual report to get these numbers. And the idea that that information isn't readily available for even elected officials to gain access to, right, is absurd. And we can't begin to make large-scale policy decisions at the state or municipal level without this information. So this project was 100% necessary to achieve that goal.
Oh, so much. Thank you, Sebastian. Well, this brings me to the next point in our presentation. Thank you so much. The Illuminators really have deep experience in their communities and are speaking much knowledge to us that we should listen to. So here are possible story hooks for the journalists in the room that hopefully will come out of this when we start to release this and ancillary reports. For one, I guess there are two big buckets. I'll take the first bucket. Jonathan will take the second bucket. The first is, can the Muck Rock help us track down all the 84 missing reports? So under the heading of accountability that our Illuminators have brought up several times.
Tom, show the screen. Share the PowerPoint screen. Thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Just want to make sure you can see it.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it.
Okay. See the slide now? Cool. Okay. Bucket one, just under the heading of accountability, our Illuminators mentioned a lot of missing data. This is not tiddlywinks. This is not trivial. This is hundreds of millions, if not billions of public dollars sort of moving willy-nilly across the ecosystems in all 49 states. It ought to be plain as day. In other words, if this is such a great thing, it ought to be present and easy to understand. Everybody should get this information. And if it's such a great thing, we're all going to go, oh yeah, great thing. Totally down with it. Super fantastic. But if it's not so great, then maybe we understand why it's so hard to get this data. So what are the penalties for non-compliance? Apparently they're nothing. Is there a legal action here? You know, do we have to lawyer up and go after the missing reports? Do we need a new law or some other kind of strengthening of laws just on the accountability side? We're not talking about the racist aspects of TIFs or the negative aspects. We're just still in the space of just where are they and what are they doing before we get to the remedies? You know what I'm saying? So, and Jonathan, would you take the second bucket?
Sure. Real quick, just to add to the first sort of bucket, the offer, and I this is really an offer to Leslie, Steph, and Sebastian, and everybody here. Is sort of let's strengthen that first bucket, looking at the red, offering how do we look at the data through a racial and ethnic disparity lens, and what does that look like? How do we track, or how do we at least request not just data, but really strengthen our red lens when it comes to extracting data from systems. The second part of that for bucket one, I'd like to add to this, is also offering up how do we look at intersectional data, intersectional points that Sebastian mentioned, you know, looking at housing displacement data, right? Looking at unemployment data, and sort of layering that with the TIF, you know, layering that with the TIF data and seeing how our TIFs actually, how have they played a role in gentrification and driving out, you know, 500,000 African Americans, Black folk out of Chicago, right? The largest reverse migration out of Chicago since the Great Migration. And same thing for every other community, the Black and Brown communities, the working class. So poverty data. I'm looking at the violence prevention data. Are the areas that these TIF districts are being built in and constructed, are those the same areas that are overlaid with the racial justice data and all the other data sets when we're looking at the impact of the Black and Brown and the communities facing challenges across the country. And then for bucket two, I just really want to read this quote to open up bucket two. By Dr. King. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society when machines and computers' profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasy on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. I think there's some I think we're facing that moment in our history and in terms of where we're at as a country. We want to connect this work to the national trends in terms of racial equity, disinvestment, displacement, and overall economic and social and justice across the country. We want to build a national TIF organizing project. Key questions is the impact on Black and Brown and white working class communities and households across the TIF districts, across the union. The impact on public education and public service, we've alluded to that in big numbers, right? But how do we tell that story and drill it down to the communities and the grassroots? Leslie, Steph, and Sebastian, I think provided you an offering as, you know, frontline change agents from their neighborhoods and communities, and gave us an incredible visual of how this can be a lightning rod to galvanize unusual suspects, to unify stratified campaigns and coalitions that are struggling on their own front, right? From the housing to the police, to all these things, and we're all stratified. This can actually be a unifying frame and lens, and ultimately reimagining how our municipalities are built. Clearly, how we're building the actual landscapes of how we're living is not sustainable by any stretch of the imagination. We already see that happening in terms of the climate crisis, and how are TIFs playing a role and sort of, you know, draining out that crisis? Or could it be shifted and used in a way that could actually help reimagine how we live physically in Chicago and in the urban cities and the rural areas, instead of being used for private gain, for Soldier Field stadiums, and, you know, for these private families that are making billions off of our taxpayers, which is atrocious and, to me, quite criminal. So we seek to support and design and implement a planning process that will overall initiate a national TIF organizing project, right? We want to pull together a powerful alliance of groups and community agencies, cross-sectorate, not just organizers, bring in a cross-sector issue, a cross-sector approach, from the journalists to the data collectors to the organizers, and cross-sector this alliance, and who are rooted in their communities and who are working towards economic and social justice, to really establish a solid, permanent TIF Illumination national initiative that will achieve collecting local stories of economic struggle, creating a cadre of local TIF illuminators across the union in the 49 states, create a national campaign to transform. We think we should abolish TIFs, but at least give people a fighting chance to make that decision at the local level, how they want to abolish it or reform it, and then bring forth full transparency and accountability on TIFs, on the ecosystem through a red lens, and goes on. The ultimate goal is to abolish, for us, this racist scheme across the country. And so we really want to amp up and amplify what we've done in Chicago. The reality is, and I'm going to be honest, I like to be honest as a trained organizer for a long time, particularly youth organizing, you can't really coat and sugarcoat the struggles, particularly with our young people who are struggling every day. And so the reality is, we're losing the battle. We're getting our asses kicked in Chicago around the TIF structure. It's a blessing to have Leslie and them representing some victories. Same thing with Detroit. But in Chicago, we, you know, as the poster child for TIFs at the national level, we were losing the battle. And even as much as we do as one agency, even our own allies have opted out of the direct action style, that have opted to be the ones to pull the lever of TIFs and say, if we only could be the ones to be the alderman to pull that lever, things will change in our neighborhoods. And our position is, we've had since 1986, 3 decades, if not more, to change that story hook, right? That storyline, and no one has done it yet. In fact, it's gotten worse. The corruption is more in depth, more embedded. We've had more aldermen hooked into TIFs as part of federal indictments, and you know, it's just, you know, it's literally out of a Netflix series. Some, like, you know, Chicago series, which just is outrageous how much is being stolen and how much we're getting taken for. So we need to amplify this issue and this phenomenon, and we need to pivot dramatically in 23, 24, and 25. It is a national plague from our perspective. It's draining whole communities of opportunity and offerings to fight the good fights on a whole number of issues. But we need the sense of urgency now. Black household wealth is heading to zero. within my son's lifetime. That's a huge thing. You know, the economic disparities are increasing across the board, across the country. We're very mindful of the oppression and the legacy of that. And so, you know, it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And so while we do this national, the statewide TIF implementation, which is critical, we're, you know, we all come from the position that this is just one foundation block, and we need to scaffold dramatically in the next 2 years. We need to really build an organized table, an alliance that can really take this phenomenon over a longer period of time, extracting the best information, knowledge, and resources we can to sort of draw the line. That's where we're at right now. And the reality is, if we don't start thinking at that strategic level, we can illuminate all we want. We can illuminate for the next 20 years, but they're just going to continue to build more and more TIFs and extract more and more dollars. And so the shift from Muck Rock Foundation is not only how do we, you know, get that wonky information and stuff like that, how can the Muck Rock Foundation play a strategic partnership role in galvanizing your networks of allies and philanthropists to say, hey, this is a moment that we can help shift the scale of justice in this country. We've invested in this so far. We want partnership investments to amp up the investment that Muck Rock has put in so that we can sustain this investigation style, direct action style illumination across the country, and really build out cadres of folks across the country that can be sustainable, that can take it on, like Leslie has, Sebastian has in Evanston, Leslie and Steph has in their communities in Berwyn and in Pilsen. And that's what we want to do. We want to amplify this across the country. We are literally in 17 cities, from Austin, Texas to Berwyn, Cincinnati, Cicero, Columbus, Detroit, Elgin, Evanston, Homewood, Houston, which is surpassing Chicago as the 3rd largest city in the country in 2 years. Madison, we're in Vancouver. We're all over the place. And so we've built a strong initial network of folks and institutions that have given us the nod. And so now we need the resources to really build a solid alliance across the country. So that's the ultimate request, is be it not only a thought partner, but help us galvanize the resources to really take on the powers that be around this issue. And I could promise you, they don't want us playing with their purse and their piggy bank or their wallet. They're very skittish when you talk to people and they're like, don't touch it. We love you. We can't change it. Don't come up with alternatives. You know, people are tying their campaigns, their family expenses to this, building houses, you name it, in Chicago. It's
so we're getting some messages
you.
that people have to drop off. So before we're done, I think Philip, do you want to add anything as someone who's been around?
Yes, I would thank Muck Rock. Thank you for this partnership. I'm really excited about, you know, the Illuminators. They make me proud as a Chicagoan who made grants to places like Little Village Environmental Justice Organization back in the day. What I would say, the critical juncture that we're in right now is that the issue itself transcends even progressive left-right bipartisanship, any kind of other way. It's the most populist issue. It's the biggest tent you could probably get, particularly in this economic crisis that's hitting everybody. Everyone's suspicious and looking at taxes, no matter what part of the political spectrum they're from. Our communities, poor communities, Black and brown communities, are disproportionately affected, but it affects all in some ways. And the sensibilities of this are kind of American, anti-democratic, anti-fairness in a way that's very fundamental and can have a lot of resonance if we can get that editorial message around through journalists, through muckrakers, and of all the political spectrum, because it's a bottom line issue on the money, and that gets people interested when times are bad.
Awesome. Well, that concludes our presentation to Muck Rock. We hope this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. We are going to send out a press release to every newsroom in the state of Illinois. and we'll stand by for the repercussions. That concludes our presentation. Do you have comments or questions?
We're also going to want to host a webinar, a national webinar. So the press release will lead up to a national webinar around our findings, using the state of Illinois as a case study. Thank you all. Any questions, comments, observations?
Well, first, thank you so much for all this. And I apologize that we have some other internal meetings coming up, so we can't dig into as many questions as we want, but I think we're going to have a few different areas where we want to follow up on. And a special thank you to the Illuminators. I think it's awesome to see that engagement for your communities and digging into wonky stuff that I think is very, you know, I think there's a lot of reporters who don't want to spend the time digging into that, and kind of doing that with such mission is great. As I was kind of listening to this, I just thought about all the sort of government-driven participatory budgeting discussions we see around the country, and kind of I think this is just such a great extension and kind of really kind of a public-driven. I just so cool. Because I've been just taking up this time. Any other team members have quick questions, comments?
I think Amanda in the comments asked if we could probably stop recording.
recording. Yeah. Yes, let me figure out how to do that.